welcome to the University of Arizona Museum of Art. I'm Lauren Rabb. I'm the curator at the museum, and on behalf of Diane Hartman and the rest of the staff that's here today, I want to thank you very much for coming, and especially on Super Bowl Sunday. Really appreciate it. Back in September, I was privileged to go to the Tucson Chinese Cultural Center and hear a marvelous presentation about the history of the Chinese in Tucson. And subsequent to that, I invited Robin Blackwood to organize a panel for this exhibition, the Border Project, so that we could present this to a broader audience. So first of all, I want to thank Robin for organizing this. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to introduce Grace, and then Grace is going to introduce our other guest speakers. But I want to, if we can just take a minute and thank Grace Delgado for coming to this presentation. She's come all the way from Penn State, where she is a professor, assistant professor of history, and her areas of expertise are border making and race making, immigration, and nationalism. But very pertinent to our discussion today, she has a book that was just published in December. It's available through Stanford University Press, and it's called Making the Chinese Mexican: Global Migration, Localism, and Exclusion in the U.S. Borderlands. Grace will also be a keynote speaker at the Tucson Festival of the Book, so you'll get another chance to hear from her, because I'm sure that most people in the audience do come to the festival. So, Grace, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
You know, it's my great pleasure to be here. I have been working on this topic, Tucson Chinese, as well as the Chinese in northern Sonora, since 1997 as a graduate student. My book had a particularly long gestation period for a number of reasons, but it's out finally, and I think for me the most touching moments have been sharing my work with the people whom I write about. And I was able to meet Norma Dawn, as well as other people whose family history, unknowingly and unwittingly, I wrote about. So, just a side note, your history is vitally important to the border region. You may not think that your family stories are of particular pertinence and importance to the history of border making, racism, exclusion. But regardless of your ethnic background or your family's migration history, your individual family stories are vitally important to people like me, a professional historian. Had I known and met these folks earlier, no regrets though, I think my book would have been much richer. So, as a result, I'm here talking about my book, themes about my book, as well as gathering other people's histories for whatever purpose, public history, maybe a second book. But today I want to talk about borders, a very serious issue, and this is again my area of specialization. You know, when we think about today's borders, we don't necessarily think about the Tucson Chinese and the making of these borders. But in fact, this is the first population by which racial constructions around immigration were conveyed. And I'll talk a little bit about that concept before or after I actually introduce my panelists, who will talk about that highfalutin notion from a very personal perspective. So here today we're at the Border Project, and I want to introduce three very special people whose stories I did not have before the book. But I'm so happy I have them now and have met them in the last few months. George and Mary Malaby, who are panelists, and Mike Lee, who's also a panelist. And what I'm going to do right now in the next few minutes, very quickly, is introduce this larger history as well as their family histories through pictures. So the larger context of their history is today. And what we see now in terms of borders are closed borders. We don't see porous borders. And we see a lot of death and violence at our borders. These borders are highly contested, and the art of this contestation is all around us. We see today, especially in Sonora, a lot of public art exhibits this particular installation, Paseo de Humanidad, really is physically on the actual border fence that divides the United States from Mexico. So even though in our lived experience we don't live these harsh realities of border crossing, we live in a border town where people close to us, families here and there, have experienced this rather harsh history. On the right, we actually see a border marker of 1913 that divided Sonora from Arizona. But on the upper left, we see what we have today. So the question today is, how did the bottom right actually morph into the top left? How were borders constructed? And what impact did this have on families and their particular family structure? In our memory, our historical memory, we do not figure in Chinese border crossers as the first illegal immigrants, as the first immigrants to actually experience the harsh desert terrain and dying in that terrain, like we associate with Mexicans today. And here is an image in 1898, dying to cross. And it's not of a Mexicano, it's of a Chinese individual. So my book is about these processes and how the border became the border it is today by looking at the Chinese and then Mexicans. Again, our panelists, their families have lived this history. But as a historian, I must say to you that this local border history is part of a global history of migration and local settlement at the border on both sides of the region, in Sonora and Mexico in particular, and Arizona and Tucson in particular. It is primarily about not Mexicanos solely, but initially Chinese, Mexicans, and Chinese Mexicans.